part of the Red Terror was the gathering of all opposition members into concentration camps outside of major cities. And these were the very first camps, and it was from these camps that the entire Gulag system developed. So they are very much a precursor to what came later in Stalin's time.
The Tsar had been reviled as a tyrant for executing a handful of violent radicals. Under Lenin and his followers, millions would die at the hands of the state.
It's difficult to calculate how many people came to die under Lenin's system and then Stalin's system, because there were so many different ways to die. There were people who died in camps, there were people who died because they were machine gunned down in the woods, there were people who died because they were deported, there were people who died in artificial famines. When you begin to put the numbers together, you get numbers, statistics in the tens of millions.
Lenin, in general, had no sympathy for human beings such as they were. He believed, as did others, that through education and legislation you can make people not want to own things. You create new human beings. So the existing human race was so rotten that killing them was actually progressive.
Amidst terror and war, Lenin was building a system of government unlike any seen before. Along with the old regime, Russia's capitalist industries, the banks, and the church were all completely destroyed. Replacing them all was a single institution, the party. Most of the Bolsheviks had no experience in business or administration, yet they drew up a plan to manage a country with the world's 5th largest economy and its 3rd largest population. The results were a far cry from heaven on earth.
By 1920, in some ways you can say that civil society and civilization had stopped. There was massive famine. The industry had broken down, the railroads stopped working, the economy had fallen apart, and people were really reverting to the most primitive kind of bartering. Massive loss of life. It was a nightmare.
By now, Russia was officially known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Bolsheviks called themselves communists. That term had long been interchangeable with socialism, but it took on a very new meaning as Lenin broke all ties with the rest of the world's socialists and formed a new international movement. He had big plans for his revolution.
Lenin said more than once that he never believed that the revolution could be confined to Russia. No, the revolution had to spread. It had to spread to the industrial countries of the West. First of all, Germany, Great Britain, ultimately the United States, and so on.
In the Marxist scheme of things, the most advanced capitalist country was the one that was supposed to be transformed first, and that was the United States of America. But ironically, socialism never gained the popularity in America that it gained in almost all other countries, basically because its main constituency, or supposed constituency, the working class, the labor unions, simply didn't accept it. They wrestled with it for a while and then rejected it.
In America, the split between trade unions and socialists goes all the way back to the very beginnings of the organized labor movement in the late 19th century. Spurred by Marx and Engels, workers' movements across Europe were gaining strength, and most were embracing socialism as their guiding philosophy. In America, too, workers were organizing, but they would choose a very different path. Led by a straight-talking cigar maker named Samuel Gompers.
The irony about Sam Gompers is that he was a Marxist who forged an anti-Marxist labor movement. Gompers was born in a poor family in London and moved to the United States in his teens, becomes a skilled cigar maker, And all this time, he is a socialist. He's reading Marx, he's reading Engels, he's reading other classics of European socialism. And he believes that the best way to organize workers to demand their emancipation, the best way to achieve socialism is by making the trade unions themselves stronger.
Gompers rejected the idea that workers needed radical intellectuals to help them achieve their goals. I saw that betterment for working men must come primarily through working men, he wrote. I saw the danger of entangling alliances with intellectuals who did not understand that to experiment with the labor movement was to experiment with human life. Gompers and his allies favored something called pure and simple unionism. It meant using strikes and boycotts to fight for better pay and benefits rather than taking political action to create a whole new system. In 1886, Gompers helped found the American Federation of Labor, uniting individual unions across the country. As the AFL's first president, his salary would be less than he earned rolling cigars. Gompers' leadership of American workers would be challenged by socialists within and without the AFL. In 1901, some of these socialists came together to form the Socialist Party of America. At the party's helm was a rival labor leader, a railway man named Eugene V. Debs.
Debs is a fascinating figure because he's one of these perennial candidates who runs for president 5 times as a Socialist Party candidate. He achieves at most 6% of the vote, which he gets in 1912. But he's an enormously popular, charismatic figure, much more than Gompers ever was.
Originally, Gompers had hoped he and Debs would work together, but he ended up calling Debs the apostle of failure. He was involved with the Western Labor Union, then the American Labor Union, then the IWW, and Gompers felt any attempt to organize a rival trade union was, in effect, doing the employer's job to weaken the union. You then had union fighting union.
By 1903, the American Federation of Labor represented more than 1.5 million union members and was becoming a force to be reckoned with in American life. At that year's AFL convention, Gompers forever parted ways with his old allies. I want to tell you, socialists, he said, I have kept close watch upon your doctrines for 30 years, have been closely associated with many of you. And I want to say that I am entirely at variance with your philosophy. Economically, you are unsound. Socially, you are wrong. Industrially, you are an impossibility. Despite Gompers' opposition, the Socialist Party continued to gain strength. Surprisingly, the party drew more support from farmers than from industrial workers. One of the greatest centers of socialist support was Oklahoma. Eugene Debs won more than 16% of the presidential vote there in 1912. But America's entry to World War I brought a turning point for the party.
In World War I, socialists in